what we want to have a sort of 20, 25 minute sort of session on, looking at the rise of decentralization. But in order to do that, what we're interested in doing is perhaps going back and looking at some of the historical aspects of how have we got to where we are. But before we do that, what I'd like to do is to just ask my panel members just to briefly introduce themselves. I'll kick off. I run a company called Team Blockchain. It's been running for about 4 years, and we basically look at how, where, and why blockchain and digital assets are being used by commercial operations. We write a weekly analysis called Digital Bytes, which basically has a series of case studies looking at different jurisdictions and different sectors, again, using the technology. And then once a month, we hold a meetup, which you're very welcome to come to, which showcases typically 3 companies, again, what have they learnt and what are the challenges and what are the benefits of the technology and digital assets. So that's essentially what we do. But I'm surrounded by our colonial friends from across the pond. So if the man from Buffalo, Jonathan, perhaps you can kick off and explain who you are and where you come from.
Good afternoon. Jonathan Dunsmore. I'm a corporate securities attorney based in Buffalo, New York, but I do travel around this crazy world of ours trying to not only educate regulators, but also startups on what blockchain is, how to use it, how to develop it properly, what type of strategic alliances they need to start and kind of develop within their own country and outside of their country. So it's kind of this mission of advocacy that is probably not going to slow down anytime soon, and I'm glad because we do realize, coming from my side of the capital markets, that the OTC markets and generally the capital markets in general are ripe with fraud and misrepresentation, and so that's one of the things we're trying to clean up.
So as part of the Empire Strikes Back theme, Antony, Abel, Richie from Canada is the accent, settled here. My background really is a serial entrepreneur and a serial financier. So I've funded and built in one form or another some 28 companies. I ran an offshore fund for a little while, ran a partnership building tech companies, and is focusing on breakout technology companies into the global marketplace. I'm particularly here because I've been focusing on the blockchain technologies, DLT technologies, and realized some 4 or 5 years ago how it's ultimately going to change the very fabric of our societies and the way that we operate and work. And that's not just in the business sense, but that is increasingly going to become our social sense. And we might even hit upon the aspects of blockchain marriages while we're sitting here on the panel. So that should be livening up the conversation a little bit for everybody in the room. But we're very keen on it, technologies. We can see where it's going. We like the element of truth that is defined by blockchain and ledger technologies, and we're here to support the economy that is coming from these technologies.
David.
Hello, my name is David Parsons. I'm with TPX Property Exchange. We're focusing on the fractionalization of property. My background, I'm the CTO of this organization. I've been doing this for now almost 2 years in terms of deploying blockchain technology with respect to tokenization of property, trading it, putting it on exchanges, and using it in the finance economy.
Brilliant. Okay, so one of the things that I'm always very keen is to not talk about the technology, because I own a mobile phone. I have no idea how it works. I struggle sometimes even know how to turn it on, but that's a different issue. So what I'd like to do is focus in on an example of an asset that most of us are familiar with because most of us actually own it, and that's property. For those of you who live in the UK, you may or may not be familiar with this, but if you were ever to buy your house off of the church, there's no stamp duty. And the reason for that is that church property is not registered with the land registry. So what I'd like to do is ask David just to take us back, because I said we're going to have a little bit of a history lesson, take us back a couple of 100 years into a situation where it was decentralized with property, because that's something you've been looking at. Can you explain what the typical situation was with property, almost on a global basis?
Sure. So 200 years ago, when you decided to purchase a house, how did that work? How did you determine if the person you're buying it from actually owned the house? What were the land rights for that house? How did you exchange money? And this pretty much didn't change for thousands of years, except for a little bit of tweaking only up till today when we got the banks involved, and the banks wanted a little bit more information. But anyway, going back 200 years, the way it worked was you would show up in a village, you would show up with your bag of real money, which was gold and silver, and there was no counterparty risk, there's no checks accepted, and then you would determine if somebody was offering a home for sale or you proffered to buy a house, they would say, okay, it's this much. In terms of determining if they own that, you would ask around their neighbors, do they own it? You would ask the local constable, or you would ask their neighbors, do they own it? And the local community would say, yeah, pretty much they own it.
So it was decentralized?
It was decentralized.
You didn't go to the local office?
There wasn't a land registry, there wasn't a book that you would go to. Everyone knew locally, decentralized, that this person owned this. And then you would exchange a bag of gold for a bill of sale, a piece of paper that says you paid this much for it, and your name was on it. And that was it. You moved into the house, and that was the property. So today, that process, effectively, as we moved into the new finance era, and we had people didn't know each other, the community became less cohesion. Then you had to prove who owned the house. There had to be a need for a land registry. People wanted to use it as collateral. So if they loaned you money, they wanted to make sure you were the person who owned it and the house was actually yours. All of these additional ecosystems evolved to make sure that you actually owned the house. It was you who were taking, if it was a mortgage, you actually owned the house and they can take it back from you. So today, we decided when we started our project was, let's see if we can go back 200 years and make the purchasing and selling of homes that easy. Bag of gold, you get the property title to the house or a bill of sale, which means you owned it. So from our evolution perspective, we've used blockchain technology to enable you to tokenize your house into fungible units, fractionalized units, and enable anyone from around the world to purchase your house, a piece of your house, immediately, and take title. That means the land registry in the UK or in the United States, the local county registrar would recognize you as the title owner, the titular owner of that.
So hang on, Dave. So I've got a house and it's $1 million and I need to raise some money for the kids'
You would
school.
sell 20% of it to someone in China instantly.
And then I pay them rent because they've lent me money?
It depends on the nature of the property. So some properties, you live in a house, there's no reason you should have to pay for that privilege. You don't need to.
So I just sell a percentage of the ownership, in effect.
They just take
So you can sell a percentage of the equity.
Here's a really fundamental truth that I think everybody in the audience will enjoy hearing, and hopefully you have enough of a study of economics to follow me on this one. The central DNA of our capitalist system and the trading that we do is based upon property and property rights. If but only you can find a distilled version of truth as to who owns that property right, whatever it might be, and have that as something that we can put in our pocket and give to the next person, and that they can trust that property right. So the trust goes with the property right. Our financial system is addicted to property. It's how it leverages its value. It's how it creates private credit. It's how it makes its money for itself. It can't arguably survive without it. Fundamentally, what's shifting now with the blockchain technologies is it puts this aspect of controlling the rights that you have of one form or another in a trusted version back into the system and taking out a lot of the middlemen who, quite honestly, haven't necessarily produced the value that we all think we should enjoy. I think I'm being very polite there. And so this blockchain technology, this aspect of trust built into the very digital representation of the thing that we own, is the lifeblood to our financial system. And what's changing in the world right now is it's making each one of you in the audience own that privilege, to be able to use that privilege for yourself and not for all the intermediaries that stand between what you own and the value you'd like to have it represent. And that's a big change. And that's going to change our economies, both in the way that they function. It's also going to change our social interactions. So for us, it's a very exciting environment. I go back to a fundamental truth about trust as well. Trust is about the number of successful transactions we have over time with people that we know. That's a fundamental truth over thousands of years. In our digital age, the world is moving too fast for us to have necessarily many transactions with one individual that we know. So we have the central pinning of identity, which you would have heard of quite a bit over the length of this conference. And you also have this aspect of how do you record successful transactions and how do you record the ownership of that thing through that process. So what we're actually seeing is blockchain is now putting trust back into anonymous digital relationships. And we should all embrace that because it's ultimately going to make our economies work.
Okay, Jonathan, that sounds all good in theory, but
It does. And
you're the cynical lawyer here.
here's the devil's advocate in me. Because we still rely on the government, right? Your government, my government, even the Canadians. We have to go to the government and say, hey, I got this deed from these guys off this blockchain thing. I want to take out a mortgage, or I want to take out debt, or I want to do one of these creative things, which I do believe is eventually going to be the backbone of our economy. But we still rely on that centralized, trusted third party being the state. And that's where things get really murky and really ugly, especially in places where this, quite frankly, is needed the most in developing countries. Because most of our wealth, as we have all articulated, comes from the property. So if I can take out equity or debt in that property, then I can have the possibility of going and starting a small business or creating this new, economy in my own country, right? My own small little nation of, I don't want to throw anybody under the bus. So that's kind of the problem I have with decentralized organization, because when you start drilling down, you hit fucking bedrock, and the bedrock generally relies on the state, and the state's not going to hand over that power to anyone or anything to a certain degree, right?
Remember, ownership, adjudication.
But David, I mean, could we just go back to history?
Yeah.
We're back in the history class, I'm sorry.
Sure.
Can we just remind people, I think most people are familiar with the fact that companies as we know them were really created by the Dutch, the concept of a joint stock company. But can you perhaps just remind us where the terminology of company and those funny things called dividends, where that comes from?
Yeah, company, the word company and the governance, a company is a company of sailors. That's where the word company comes from. They were on a small ship and it was a company of sailors. And occasionally they would find booty, pirate, and they would be pirates. And at the end of the voyage, they would divvy up, divide all of the spoils. That's where the word dividends come from. So a company of sailors, and they produce dividends for the owners of the ship. Okay,
so the reason I wanted David just to remind us of that is that very interesting at the moment, one topic that isn't talked about because it's sort of, it's just almost the elephant in the room, and that is these things called ICOs, not the Information Commission Officer, but initial coin offerings, which at the moment have kind of gone to one side because they are seen as being dodgy, nefarious actors, and to be fair, a lot of money was raised, but a lot of money was stolen. But very interestingly, the word pirate reminds me of a conversation that I had 2 weeks ago with a French lawyer of a very large law firm, and perversely the following day with a Dutch lawyer. And they're arguing that the precedent of the way pirates were financed, i.e. the crown typically, or wealthy individuals, the equivalent of accredited investors, professional investors, high net worths, gave a pirate a few bars of gold. He went out, and she went out, and actually bought ships, men and arms. The French would go and beat up the Brits would beat up the Spanish would beat up the Dutch, and we were all beating each other up and bringing up the booty back, dividing it up,
exactly,
giving the money to the crown and wealthy people. In the UK, the most famous of all of those pirates is some chap called Nelson. If you wander out of here, you'll see where he is on that lump of concrete in the square next door, and that's how he became such a proficient sailor.
And by the way, just to interject, in the U.S. Constitution, this concept of privateering, it's called privateering, it's called letters of marque and reprisal. It's in the United States Constitution. But the President of the United States can actually
But what it is,
this.
It's not a company.
Yeah.
It's not a debt instrument. Perversely, it's a gentleman's agreement. I'll give you this. If you're successful, we're sharing the booty. And so these French and Dutch lawyers are currently arguing with the French and Dutch government, we want to use this as a 400-year-old precedent to enable small and medium-sized businesses to raise money. I personally believe, with the terrible situation the world's facing with coronavirus, small and medium-sized companies are going to squeal to raise money like we've never heard before. And governments will look to change the rules and regulations potentially to actually encourage this so-called decentralized systems, and they're relying on precedents which are 400 or 500 years old. So it's just a slight aside. But Jonathan, I'm interested. So do you think that you're going to see more blockchain coming into society? And if so, is that a good thing?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I say on my LinkedIn, everybody follow me. I'm a blockchain believer because for these reasons that these gentlemen are working on, you want to have this trusted, non-third party that says, I actually own this. And so whether it is a central backed currency that, in theory has its own problems, but is centrally backed, it allows us to do transactions across borders. And that's where we all know the world is coming to. We talked about globalization for years and years and years. And now that it's here, we're going, oh crap, we need to learn how to trust each other first. And, going to
but how do you enforce the law? We've done a transaction globally. We don't know each other.
The same way we trusted each other back 200 years ago.
But we were in the same village then.
Well, but that's what I'm kind of alluding to is the internet is that village.
So that's the digital village.
That's the digital village that we're starting to slowly create. Like you said, you don't understand what's going on in your phone, but we've had enough conversations. I've seen you on Skype, unless you're pulling some really clever AI tricks or using deep fakes or something. I know that's you. Now, once again, when we start using blockchain technology, hopefully we'll be able to see that, oh, I am a New York licensed attorney, and here's my bar, right? Here's my degree. Here's all these other things that are verifiable through this non-trustless, third party on a blockchain. So it's immutable, right? And should the bar decide to revoke...
But what about the governance, though? When things go wrong, who decides...
That's what I said, there's always bedrock. And that bedrock comes back down to the government because the government is, regardless, like I said, whether it's mine or yours, nobody's going to give this position up. They would be ludicrous too.
In the systems that we're designing, we're very focused on the role of government. Government is third party governance, transparency, trust, regulation. There is a place for this in the blockchain world. The key thing, it adds a reference point and it helps to police the systems that we ourselves are creating from the community. That's important because, quite honestly, any which way you cut it, you need that third party to play a role. The key thing is we only want it to play a role that's efficient and not inefficient.
Okay, but Tony, so you're creating a system which potentially embraces a centralized system, like a land registry.
Yes.
But you've gone, I understand you've spoken to the regulators here in the US, in the UK, and the US, and Europe.
Yeah, absolutely.
And presumably they've been pretty cynical about what you're doing and saying, well, hang on, this sounds a bit odd. What's the reception been?
Well, we could handle this two ways. I mean, when we approach them, two things. One is we weren't asking them to do anything terribly different. We're asking them to enshrine the existing workflow processes they have and, where appropriate and applicable, allow blockchain technology to exist within them. They effectively agreed that that is a principle that they wish to pursue. And blockchain technology, as we can see, is something that they finally got to a point of acceptance to. It's a good idea generally. Now, they have some views about crypto, but that's a bit different. So blockchain, DLT, ledger technologies are here to stay. The other aspect to this is a need. There's actually joint endeavor, joint need starting to happen. A lot of our economies are suffering. They'll probably continue to suffer for a whole series of macroeconomic reasons that I can trust you don't want us to go into. But if you start to look at that, their need is actually coming to a point where they have to embrace these technologies or suffer a catastrophic loss of value in their own economies.
So are we seeing a merger, would you say, sorry, Professor History here, David, do you think we're seeing a merger between almost being able to reinforce a centralized, if we stick with property, a centralized trusted database, either land registry, but the way you can get on and off ramp almost is using this technology? Is that a way to look at it?
When you adjudicate who owns a piece of property, it's done by levels of evidence. The land registry actually doesn't determine if you own the property. It's only one piece of evidence or trust that you've...
So that's the trust that Tony...
Exactly. So if you can show that I paid for it, I've received a title to it, I've been using it in a transaction, then that helps you convince you, if using blockchain terminology, it's 6 blocks deep. That means you own the property. So this is just adding to what already exists in terms of law, in terms of people's understanding of who owns a piece of property and how to use it.
But that's where we jump into the complexities of identity, right? Jonathan Dunsmore, I know there's 3 of me, right? They're not attorneys.
Oh my goodness, surely not.
Everybody prepare. But there's 3 people that share my name. And so if one of them was to go and register a piece of property, how do I not go to that same deed office or government and say, hey, I'm actually them, I need my property?
Well, that gets back to the blockchain. It's possession.
Exactly.
So if you own the key, remember, blockchain is typically non-nominative. If you own the key and you can show that you can control the key, then you own it. You know, possession is 9/10 of the law. In this case, it's 100%, 10 out of 10.
And the systems that lead up to a lot of this, you know, when we're doing the work around, because we do some of this work together, the work that's taken through to the point where you create a property that could be traded in a blockchain environment. Well, hello, search, survey, existing workflow process, checking the provenance, checking all the rights, making sure they're properly captured, properly stated, verify, validate, audit, check. But once you've created that record, how many times do you have to do it again to have the same version of truth?
Yeah,
Ideally, not many.
Exactly.
Yeah, but when you move property,
the value of blockchain.
Yeah, exactly. So from a practical perspective, when you move property in, say, the United States, in some states you're spending 10% of the total value as a cost to move a piece of property. In England, it's about 3 or 4%, I think. Yeah, you know what it is.
Europe, it's 6-7%.
6 or 7%, and that's going to inefficiencies. It's going to some conveyancer, some attorney, some notary saying, yes, I looked at your passport, it's you, maybe not, but you know, I'll sign the conveyancing deed. So really, we're making the movement of property very frictionless. And we're taking out the inefficiency, dramatically taking out the inefficiencies.
I mean, to be bold here for a second, and a good takeaway for everybody here, we see the world changing. Libra was a good initiative. It's based on debt. Our future economies, we believe, on a macroeconomic, are moving to an asset-based economy. We no longer pay ourselves with fiat. We pay ourselves with digital tokens representing a physical asset, which we can all check on the blockchain, on the internet, and we can have trust in. It's very hard sometimes to trust our central bankers because they're printing up a hell of a lot of money right now, and they have no way of paying they're cashing checks they can never pay, or writing checks they can never pay, I should say. And so this economy, this thinking, this aspect of moving to an asset-based economy where we can get back to trusting each other and trading properly is something that we certainly embrace.
So expanding on that, one of the gentlemen were talking about, you know, actually owning your own data and saying, hey, this person, this is his data. You know, maybe I can trade my data that I own as a decentralized person as having, you know, possibly the US government rein me in, but we'll see. And I can come to you and say, hey, this is how much, you know, assets I own, this is my data. Maybe you should let me have some money so I can go buy this property on a blockchain. And then this is a crowdsourced event. Everything is kind of put up on chain. They say, well, we've verified it through, you know, data analytics that this person is who they say they are. It's 100019788K, whatever. And he needs a loan. We judge his credit worthiness as this, all on chain.
Okay, so an example of how decentralized technology is helping to prove provenance, create trust, and then hopefully make improve the efficiency of an asset that we know.
Yeah.
Try to cut out the bedrock.
Just mindful of time. Has anyone got any? Anyone violently disagree with anything we've said, or have you got a question? Yes, sir. Have we got a microphone, or just
Shout loudly.
Just shout loudly.
Yeah.
Oh, here it comes.
Oh, there we go. Here it comes.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. So could you talk about where you are with this? Because it sounds like there's a challenge in adoption that you need to get for land registry. You need to get a large area, you know, whether it's a county or a town.
A country.
Country.
To adopt. And I think there have been some cases like Honduras, I understood, was an initial thing. And eventually they didn't go through, and then Sweden. Could you talk about, you know, the challenges of adoption and, you know, compared to...
The issue here isn't one of adoption. I might surprise you with that. What we've actually done is mirror what has been a legal practice for 50 years. I don't want to go into all the details because it's somewhat bespoke. But the legal structures we use are in use for 50 years, and the land registries have no choice but to use this system because they're already using it. And therein lies the difference. The key thing is not to try to go, we're not trying to change the world violently. We're trying to enable it. And so enabling it means you use better systems and processes that match the existing workflow process, not try to change it.
So you're not trying to replace the land registries, as we said earlier.
No.
You're trying to make the on-off ramp to the land registry just more efficient. Is that the way to look at it?
We'll make it very efficient, is the short answer.
We're-
And the records that we're producing will be much more comprehensive with the land registries and the deed offices. They love this because they have security concerns, and our security and systems and processes and checks and balances are much more thorough than theirs. The land registry is the authoritative source. That will never change. But they're also checking our land
One of
registry
the
against theirs.
authoritative sources.
Okay.
Well, that's what I was arguing, is that it could change depending on how much data is available
Yes.
on chain.
We're enabling that.
Yeah.
All our stuff is wide open to the land registry. We don't own it. It's information that we've collected on that property. Arguably, we've collected a lot better.